Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
President Trump expected to mark his first year back in office today by meeting the press. Welcome to the Tuesday edition, with expectations that the boss is just about to walk in the room, heading downstairs to the briefing room any moment now, with throngs of reporters waiting for him and many questions about his designs on Greenland and threats to add new tariffs on many of our NATO allies. We're going to get the latest in a moment from Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall. And we'll talk with Daniel Fried, the former U.S. ambassador to Poland, now at the Atlantic Council. We'll share his insights coming up as President Trump heads for Davos tonight. And we'll have analysis from our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are here for the hour. Let them hear. It's about as crowded as it gets. I think the fire marshal might need to check on this situation. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, we will keep eyes on what's happening at the White House. The daily briefing was scheduled to begin now. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt on X earlier saying that there would be a special guest. Now it is expected that guest, none other than Donald J. Trump. 1 year to the day after coming back to the White House. Indeed, 1 year since the inauguration, that the president is gassing up Air Force One, about to cross an ocean to deliver a very stern warning to many of our NATO allies, having spent the weekend warning them on social media. And in the news, we caught up with him on the tarmac as the president came back from the football game last evening with many questions about his designs on Greenland and opposition that we are hearing from the European Union. Listen.
I don't think they're going to push back too much. Look, we have to have it. They have to have this done. They can't protect it. NATO's been warning Denmark for about 20 years now, longer than that, 25 years. They've been warning Denmark about the Russian threat. And it's not only Russia, it's also China. So we'll see what happens. But let's put it this way. It's going to be a very interesting Davos.
It's going to be a very interesting Davos, and we're going to be following all the president's footsteps when he gets to Switzerland. Wheels up tonight. He'll be speaking tomorrow morning, pre-market our time, about what's expected to be an affordability address. He's talking about prices here in the United States, even while following up with NATO leaders on Greenland, promising an additional 10% tariff on those countries pushing back or working with Denmark in this case, and then threatened an additional 200% tariff on France for its wine and champagne, when Emmanuel Macron pushed back on this idea of a board of peace the president is establishing for Gaza. We've got a lot to talk about with Tyler Kendall, and as I mentioned, we'll be joined in a moment by former Ambassador Daniel Fried with us in studio here as we stand by for President Trump at the White House. Tyler joining us now from our Washington bureau. Do we have a sense of what he wants to say, Tyler?
Yeah. Hey, Joe. I mean, at this point, we know that the White House is touting that it has been 1 year in office for the second Trump administration. Just moments ago, they kicked out a fact sheet to us reporters here in Washington, calling it 365 wins in 365 days. So it is clear that the president is going to come out and push his policies forward. As we know, this White House has been on defense on a range of issues. Most notably, of course, is affordability. And you framed it perfectly at the top there, because as we await his speech to Davos tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Eastern, we're really starting to see the domestic and foreign policy agendas collide, right? This administration has already previewed that this is going to be a speech focused on the cost of living. We've heard from officials that there is going to be a particular emphasis when it comes to bringing down home prices and some potential proposals there. The NEC director, Kevin Hassett, floating that we'll see this plan related to allowing people to pull from their 401ks for a down payment on a home. Yet at the same time, there's this backdrop of what has only been escalating tensions in recent days. You mentioned that tariff threat from towards our European allies that have backed Greenland. And Joe, our own reporting indicates that our European allies are planning their own potential retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. They're also poised to halt that U.S.-EU trade deal that was struck this summer but hasn't been ratified yet by the European Parliament. Now, Joe, as you know, we We heard from the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier today, who's urging calm. He's saying that he doesn't think there's going to be this retaliation, but it's worth pointing out that our own analysts at Bloomberg Economics say that if the U.S. does follow through on this tariff threat, it would reduce the exports from the impacted countries to the U.S. by up to 50%. The last thing I'll throw at you is that we have also heard, not just from the Treasury Secretary appearing to try to turn down the temperature, if you will, but the House Speaker Mike Johnson was in the UK today addressing the United Kingdom's Parliament. He himself said that he was trying to calm the waters. So it appears that across the Republican Party here, there is some effort to try to perhaps rein in the president's rhetoric as he heads into this very important speech tomorrow at Davos.
Just want to ask you just quickly, Tyler, about this text to the leader of Norway. The president equating his ambitions for Greenland and possibly taking over Greenland with his failure to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He wrote, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." Do we know what he meant by that?
Well, we should also say that it's not the Norwegian government that awards this prize, which is perhaps a wrinkle in what President Trump is putting forward here. But it is just the latest in what has been a series of disputes that President Trump has elevated ahead of going over to Davos and ahead of him really pushing forward that he is committed to his plans when it comes to Greenland. Now, we know that there's diplomatic channels that are still open after talks in Washington last week. What they could materialize in remains to be seen, whether that is strategic, defense, economic cooperation. But Joe, as you're outlining here, his message to Norway, his message to the French President Emmanuel Macron, who raised concerns not just about Greenland, but also his proposed peace plan in Gaza and threatening that 200% tariff threat. It does appear that he is singling out perhaps some of these leaders. I'll throw one other at you. The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte found his own text messages shown to the public to President Trump. So it's very clear here that the president is singling out perhaps some leaders that he wants to see some different sort of cooperation with.
Yeah, text exchanges with Macron, Rutte, and Starmer all made public. Tyler, thank you so much. Tyler Kendall's going to have a lot to cover coming off of this conversation, and I'm glad that we're joined in the room by a voice of experience. And I want to note, producer James just let me know that everyone has been seated in the briefing room, which might mean that our special guest, as Caroline Levitt put it, might be about to enter. Daniel Freed, Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, a voice of reason on this program for many years running now, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Mr. Ambassador, it's great to see you, and I appreciate your being with us today.
Thanks for
having me. I'll apologize in advance if we get interrupted by this briefing. It wouldn't be the first time. What is it that we are seeing unfold here? We're told that NATO is on the line. Could this be the end of the alliance, or is it strong enough to withstand whatever Donald Trump is about to throw at it?
Well, we don't know what we're dealing with because we don't know whether Donald Trump is pressing hard for the sake of some sort of reasonable deal, or whether he really wants to attack a NATO ally, attack Denmark to seize Greenland. There is still a path to a successful resolution. President Trump says we have security interests in Greenland. Quite right. President Trump has argued that the European allies in NATO have not done enough to counter these threats. Okay, there's a case. Yeah. So the deal that should happen is the allies step up to do more on Arctic security, and Trump claims a win. That's best case, and it is an achievable case. Okay. The Danes, the Europeans would go along with it, but the president keeps saying he wants to commit aggression, there's no other word for it, and seize territory of a loyal ally which sent troops to Iraq and Afghanistan for us.
Yes.
So how this turns out, I can't say. There is still a path to a decent outcome, rough but okay, in which case the NATO alliance will continue. But if President Trump, if the United States becomes an aggressor for no good reason, then we have a problem in the alliance, and the United States grand strategy that has been so successful for decades would be put at risk, again, for no good reason.
We should note that Denmark was responding to an Article 5 incursion to help protect the United States in those wars. So this is a wild moment that we are in. The president is about to speak in the briefing room. Are European leaders glued to this like you and I are?
Sure.
Yeah.
The Europeans want a resolution, but they don't want to cave to unreasonable demands and be bullied by Washington for no good reason. So they're looking for a way forward and a way out of this, but they're not going to cave easily. Denmark has called on European solidarity and has received it. Denmark has also sent troops to Greenland. Now, those troops are there because the U.S. has said Denmark needs to do more for Arctic security.
Yeah.
But they are there, and the Danes have said they will defend the Kingdom of Denmark.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of history here that could be potentially unwoven. And I'm wondering what's going through your mind when you consider the decades of blood and treasure spent on creating this alliance, how quickly it could break down.
Well, the genius of American strategy has been that our allies wanted to work for us.
Yeah.
We didn't have to occupy them. We didn't have to threaten them. We weren't like the Kremlin with its satellites in the Cold War.
Yeah.
Our allies wanted to work with us. And all we had to do is listen to them and work with them. Now, the Trump administration has argued with justice that the allies weren't putting enough into defense. Well, they've won that argument. The Trump administration can claim a win. American presidents-backed Eisenhower have complained about inadequate European defense capability. Well, now that's resolved. The Europeans are going to pitch in. So take the win. And American grand strategy, the creation of NATO, it wasn't charity. It was in our own interest. If the Trump administration wants the Europeans to do more, if we want to change the rules of trade so that the American working class sees more benefits, okay, this is all doable. But to trash the alliance, for what? Every single U.S. security interest in the Arctic and Greenland can be better addressed by working with our allies, not against them.
The president wants to build a board of peace, and he's invited other world leaders to pay $1 billion for a permanent seat on this board. Mr. Ambassador, one of the people invited, someone you've been in the room with before, Vladimir Putin, who must be loving this conversation that you and I are having right now. Is this board of peace to somehow replace the UN Security Council has been suggested? Because it looks more like maybe a Warsaw Pact than a NATO.
Well, the original notion of a board of peace was a group of leaders to back the Israeli-Gaza settlement,
yes,
and potentially to back a diplomatic way forward in the Middle East. So
yes, right.
My initial thought was, hey, this makes sense, this could work. But inviting Vladimir Putin is questionable.
He was bombing civilian neighborhoods last night.
And inviting the dictator of Belarus?
Yeah.
What is that about? It makes...
Would never happen, would it?
Well, I don't understand the sense of it. So a board of peace could make sense, but if you misapply it by inviting Vladimir Putin, who's committing an aggressive war against Ukraine and not winning, I don't see how American interests are advanced.
How do you then read this note to the leader of Norway? I read this to Tyler a moment ago. Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. So what's the mission of the Board of Peace for which he is chair?
I don't know how to describe that note, except to say that petulance is something that we try to urge our kids to drop by the time they're in middle school. You don't threaten a war against one ally because a committee in another country didn't give you an award you thought you deserved. What is that about? On many issues that are controversial, like Venezuela or Iran, I can see the Trump administration's arguments. You can argue them both ways. With respect to Greenland, I see no case for what the Trump administration is demanding.
Interesting.
Unless they settle for Allied support for Arctic security, in which case, okay, rough start, decent finish. But demanding an annexation of Greenland? What is this? The 19th century? And American foreign policy and American values from the Declaration of Independence are antithetical to aggression like this. That's what we fought against in the 20th century. We succeeded. Let's not fall into the trap of repeating the mistakes of the enemies we vanquished.
The 18th century. All right, this is going to be interesting. I just heard from a terminal subscriber who's listening to our conversation right now, and he frames, I think, what a lot of people are feeling when it comes to the president's posture to Europe. This is wild, says Ryan. People actually entertaining the idea as if we would attack. This is Trump 101. The whole world up in arms. Also, Europe is such a hoax geopolitically and economically. So to be clear, EU farmed out the military to us. They farmed out energy to Russia. They farmed out the economy to China. But they're serious about being serious now?
Well, that language is rough, but I get the point.
Okay.
Europe allowed itself to be too dependent on Russian energy. They're fixing that. They allowed their militaries to get too weak after the end of the Cold War. American pressure has been effective. And so that second critique makes sense. As far as dependence on China, well, we're at fault as well. We have allowed the Chinese to game the international trade system, to take advantage of it and not play by the rules. So the answer to that surely is to unite the free world, like we used to, and push back against China. So the person who asked those questions has point. And the way to answer that is the old American way, which is to rally the free world to push back against the authoritarians. And if you want to push the Europeans to do more, fine. In fact, full credit to the Trump administration for doing so. But if you trash the alliance, who is going to be with us? You don't need allies until you do.
That's quite a line, Ambassador. Does he have a point? People entertaining this idea as if we would attack is Trump 101. He has no plans to attack. It's escalation to de-escalate.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah.
There's a good argument that what Trump is doing is putting pressure on everybody, grabbing attention to use it as leverage. This is possible. And that would be a decent path, well, a rough path to a decent outcome. I get that. But the threat of aggression is a problem and ought to disturb Americans.
Getting back to Putin here, he talks to Donald Trump from time to time.
Sure.
The president has said that. We don't tend to hear about it. We don't get a readout as if you would see in a traditional administration following a call with a foreign leader. You think they've talked about Greenland? By way of Ukraine? Even you handle your hemisphere, I'll handle mine?
The Russians love drawing lines on a map. And the Russians, the Kremlin, is delighted by this latest fight between Europe and the United States over Greenland. And when your adversaries are laughing themselves sick with glee, you ought to think whether what you're doing is the right thing to do.
Is that what's happening?
Well,
they're laughing in the Kremlin.
The Kremlin is just chortling. They love it, especially because Trump's policy toward Ukraine could be successful and has made a lot of progress. That is, since the blow-up between President Trump and President Zelensky in the Oval Office on February 28th last year, we've made a lot of progress. The security framework the U.S., Europe have put in place or are putting in place for Ukraine could work. This is pretty serious stuff. Trump administration could succeed in bringing peace to Ukraine. Trump could get a huge win First, he needs to land the deal with the Ukrainians, and I'm disappointed that the last talks in recent days in Florida didn't land the deal. The Ukrainians want the deal. Land the deal on security, and then push the Russians to accept it. Trump could do that. We have the leverage. We have the cards.
Yeah.
A big win is achievable. So why sacrifice that for the sake of what? Annexing Greenland?
Yeah.
Fighting with our allies? American interests are what Trump says he's after. So there's a win here for the United States, for the free world, and also it would vindicate Trump. He brings peace to Ukraine. He'd be able to say, hey, I did it, Joe Biden didn't.
Yep.
So land the deal. Bring it home.
According to his count, that'd be 9 wars. An ever optimistic but sober Ambassador Fried. We want to add our political panel to our conversation here, if we could do that. Waiting for President Trump to walk into the briefing room. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis are with us. Jeanne is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick, our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne, is the ambassador maybe pointing us down a potential path for Trump? People are outraged by what they read on Truth Social over the weekend. They have a lot of questions about what he's going to say to Davos tomorrow. But is this going to end up being some sort of 4D chess that ends with a peace deal in Ukraine and not taking over Greenland, maybe an enhanced agreement with our NATO allies?
Absolutely. I think the ambassador paints a beautiful off-ramp where it is a big win for the United States. And God willing, in my view, we go down those ramps vis-a-vis Ukraine and Greenland. I think my longer term concern is, you know, as we look to Europe making trade deals with Latin America, going to India, meetings between various European leaders and China, what are the long-term devastating impacts on our alliances and our allies who feel that the stability that was the United States and that they could always turn to is not there anymore? To me, that soft power long-term damage is really frightening. But absolutely, let's hope that he takes an off-ramp on Greenland and he secures peace with Ukraine.
Rick, have we ignored the Arctic? Has our strategy fallen short? The president is going out of his way to make clear that our national security is riding on having this territory.
Yeah, I think if you talk to people like Senator Dan Sullivan, from Alaska, he will tell you that the Russia threat specifically and China also in the Arctic is real. And I think that with the warming of the oceans and the melting of the ice, especially around northern parts of the Arctic, around Greenland, then yes, you immediately have to start thinking about it as navigable waters and therefore potential for military action. So it certainly doesn't take much saber rattling by China and Russia to get the message. That being said, nothing precludes us from exerting our security interests with the treaties that we already have in place. They were very smart to have stationed bases in Greenland in the past, and no limit to what we can do really there security-wise in the future. I do think, this issue of sort of leveraging Greenland to get a deal in Ukraine would be a great outcome. That being said, we used to say in the first term of Donald Trump, don't listen to what he says, just watch what he does, right? And people liked some of his policies, and so they were willing to accept that construct. For the last year, to date, you had to actually listen to what he said, because what he said pretty much is what he did. Sure, he rattled the sabers on trade, but he really did start a trade war. He talked about invading countries, and he did. So I really don't think it's a strategy on his part to want to acquire Greenland and even Canada. I think that he really believes that the U.S. should have the right to this kind of sort of pseudo-Monroe doctrine that he's been articulating. So not only, be prepared, but listen to what he says, because it's most likely what he's going to try to do.
Watching Wall Street, I want to mention quickly the S&P 500 extending its decline now to the lows of the session. We're down 1.6% on the S&P. The NASDAQ is down 1.8%, down 434 points as we wait to hear from the boss here. Ambassador Fried, if I listen to all of the smart people around me, then am I to believe that taking over Greenland would do nothing to enhance our national security?
Oh, it would damage our national security. We would gain nothing. We would lose our allies. We would make enemies of Denmark. No one would trust us.
Wow.
There is no upside.
That's the end of NATO, then.
There is no upside to seizing Greenland. There is every upside in making a deal with the allies about Arctic security. Your guest nailed it. But if there is a potential Russian threat to Arctic security, why are we ignoring the actual Russian threat in Ukraine where they are conducting a war? If Russia is an adversary, treat them accordingly. Strengthen security in the Arctic and strengthen Ukraine's ability to resist Russian aggression and press Russia to end the war.
Escalate to de-escalate. Jeanne, I think Rick was the first to remind us of the playbook earlier in the broadcast. Is that what we're seeing here? Is that what's about to happen? Is the taco news conference?
I hope so, Joe, but I am not convinced that Donald Trump is famous for saying things that are outrageous. And sure, he doesn't follow through with all of them. But even just what he is saying out loud, these threats to our closest allies who secured peace, who with us secured peace for the last 80 years and ensured economic and military security around the globe. The fact that he is threatening to blow that up, to me, is so outrageous and detrimental to our long-term interests. It almost, I won't say doesn't matter what happens next, because it surely does. But the damage, I think, is already done. And just look at the economics of it. With Europe, we are 50 trillion in GDP. We are going to, attack Europe? And we send ourselves back to 26 trillion GDP. What sense does that make economically? And all of these tariff threats, let's not forget, he likely doesn't have the constitutional right to impose them. And whether the Supreme Court comes out or not, who is paying for all of this is the American public. None of this makes sense monetarily, security-wise. So, Donald Trump's threats, I don't, other presidents could have made them. There's a good strategic reason that they didn't. They don't help the United States.
Rick, what do you make of the president's evening on social media? He was up half the night. I mean, it's dozens of posts, not just the tweets or the texts, I should say, to Emmanuel Macron, to Ruth Starmers and who he actually posted publicly with Macron writing, "I do not understand what you're doing on Greenland." But he also was putting up AI images. He's got planting a flag in Greenland with the vice president, the secretary of state behind him. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, there you go. There's a lot of this stuff to go around here. Revealed conversations that were thought to be private, all in the wee hours of the night. How should people interpret this stuff, whether they voted for Donald Trump or not?
It's an interesting dynamic with a president who, according to a report I saw this morning, his 1 year in presidency posted 6,000 social media messages. Many of them, if not the vast majority of them, have the standing of making policy, right? We gave up years ago putting out press releases from departments, agencies, and the White House announcing policy decisions. Now it's just a true social post and a follow-up executive order. So, yeah, I mean, it is kind of hard to see whether or not the American public is absorbing the frenetic nature of this president and the way he makes decisions and how policies are implemented. Because when he does these things, it affects hundreds, if not thousands, of government employees at the highest levels all the way down to the bottom. To then implement something they only have a few lines of a social media point to reflect as policy. And so it is incredibly disruptive to government agencies that have the requirement to actually act on the words that the president says. So it is a dynamic that it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because he, I think, is the only person to be doing this in the future. And so will it all change when there's a new president in 29?
Right. I've said it before. If I woke up and found that my kid was doing this all night, we'd have to have a family meeting. If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, we are standing by for a news briefing with the President of the United States. That's a live view of the White House briefing room on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. It's a packed house. Reporters have been seated. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who is in the room, has given us 2 points of information. Number one, they just put water on the podium, so let's hope that means he's out soon. This is a briefing that was scheduled more than a half hour ago. They've also distributed documents to the reporters in the room, which is not typical before a White House briefing. The headline on the document, 365 wins in 365 days. Yes, this is the anniversary. Year one. President Trump's return marks new era of success and prosperity. And then there is a list of bullets describing what has taken place or accomplished in the last 365 days. We're spending time with our political panel, Rick Davis, Jeanne, Zaino, alongside Ambassador Daniel Fried, which is a great honor to have so much time with you, Ambassador, and I appreciate that. Sure. A year in, how would you describe the foreign policy of this White House?
Mixed with a grade of incomplete. That is, there was a successful NATO summit, which is almost forgotten in the latest drama about Greenland, where the president scored a major success getting allies to commit to greater defense spending and then embrace the alliance. Good success. I give a lot of credit both to the president and his ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker. This was solid. This year, there has been the arrest of Maduro in Venezuela. You can argue that both ways, I think.
Yep.
Legally, there are a lot of questions, but nobody's going to miss, at least nobody in the free world is going to miss Maduro. Mm-hmm. And with Iran, how the U.S. and the Trump administration struggle to figure out how best to play this, that is the kind of policy deliberation other administrations would have engaged in. Yeah. So I have some sympathy for the Trump administration trying to deal with that. Mm-hmm. So until the Greenland blow up, again, for no good reason, you could make a claim that the Trump administration had played rough on tariffs, but had cut deals in the end, had not forced the economy over the cliff with respect to China. Mm-hmm. So you could make a case. You could also make a criticism, but it wasn't the kind of disaster that many feared, and not the kind of disaster that is threatened now over Greenland.
Really interesting. It's almost a similar answer if you asked an economist to describe his economic agenda here. Is the Monroe Doctrine real?
Well, let's be clear. The Monroe Doctrine was not a doctrine for an American empire.
Yes.
It was a doctrine that said the era of European empires in the Americas is over.
Right.
Okay, that's what it was. Uh-huh. Then the Roosevelt corollary, Theodore Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in the early part of the 20th century was basically the U.S. is going to intervene in countries along the Caribbean for the sake of stability and our interests. Mm-hmm. That turned out to have a lot of weaknesses. Yeah. And then we started getting away from that kind of interventionism and built a good relationship with Latin America. Mm-hmm. So going back to the Monroe Doctrine, but also distorting it to pretend that it is an era of American domination makes no sense. And by the way, the claims against Canada, here's a little known fact. The United States tried to conquer Canada twice. They beat us both times. You go to Parliament Hill in Ottawa, the Canadian capital, you will see a monument to the defenders of Canada beating the Yankee attackers. Okay, we failed. And Canada is now a great friend. Mm-hmm. Canada hasn't spent enough on its military. They've allowed that to be neglected. We have some legitimate complaints. But for God's sakes, we're going to start talking about aggression against Canada?
Yeah. Well,
This is not responsible behavior.
you saw Mark Carney last week, Jeanne, Zaino, cutting a trade deal with China. Isn't that the side effect?
Absolutely is. And can I just add to the ambassador's list? I'm not saying he would include these, certainly, about things that are troubling over the last year about foreign policy. You know, the destruction of U.S. aid, which even Susie Wiles said she had challenges with, and our soft power more broadly is very troubling, as well as the way in which the administration has decided to completely ignore international law. And I just point to the blowing up of the boats, off of Venezuela. There are other examples I would give, and I agree on Greenland, but I think it goes back a little bit earlier over the last year. Certainly the tariffs didn't have the destructive effect yet, although we are just a year in now. And certainly in my mind, that destruction is going to be in the American taxpayer's pocketbook. But to me, those two things are other examples of very troubling signs in foreign policy for this administration.
We're still at session lows here. We're actually carving new lows in the S&P 500, down 1.73%. I guess that's about where it was last time we checked, down 120 points. Rick Davis, what do you make of the market reaction here? Is this just itchy investors after seeing recent highs, a little worried about earnings season, or is this another Sell America theme?
Well, the news circulating around the markets today seems more focused on the Sell America theme. Obviously, the screed of Texas that happened last night sort of fell into that category for investors, and certainly the fact that you have this market decline and pressure on the bond markets all at the same time is reminiscent of Liberation Day and the markets after the decisions to implement these tariffs. So there seems to be some commonality between those two things, and that's really my question for today's presser with President Trump is he going to address that, or is he going to just take a victory lap, on his way out to Davos, for his first year in office? My guess is it's probably the latter, and we'll see whether or not Secretary Bessent sort of addresses any of the market turmoil today. But my guess is while in the comfort zone of freezing weather in Davos, Switzerland, he'll stick to script.
Tomorrow's speech, something that we're going to remember a year from now. We're talking about where we were a year earlier here with the president being sworn in. There's so much noise every day and so much emphasis on so many things that don't always justify emphasis. Tomorrow is a landmark. Will it be in the history books?
Depends on what he says,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
President Trump loves to create drama and dominate the stage. Sometimes those moments pass and are quickly forgotten because we're on to the new drama.
Yeah.
The risk is that the president will take a step from which we cannot recover. And by the way, your guest said that taking down USAID was a problem. Yes, so was attacking American broadcasting. One of the reasons we won the Cold War is because of our Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty broadcasts into the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Shouldn't we be broadcasting into Venezuela now? Shouldn't we be broadcasting into Iran? The Trump administration tried to take down our capacity to do so, only to find that it, may need it.
Yeah.
So taking down the infrastructure of American influence is a pretty expensive proposition. There's hard power, there's the military. But the reason we won the Cold War was at least as much soft power. Don't trash it. You may need it.
Might be time to take another look at the VOA. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. I appreciate your insights greatly, as always. That's Daniel Fried. There's only one. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We're going to keep our panel handy here as we wait for Donald Trump to join reporters in the briefing room. He's about 40 minutes late. at some point he will emerge and you'll hear and see the president live on Bloomberg TV and radio. I mentioned the stock market. This is getting to be a little bit rocky here today. It's not been fun since the early going, but the news that we've been discussing is helping to drive prices lower. I want to update the markets. Charlie Pellet has his eyes on things live from World Headquarters in New York. Charlie, take it away.
Right now we are looking at lows of the day. Joe Mathieu with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining. 68.17 where we stand on the S&P. That is a drop now of 122 points, down 1.8%. Dow Industrials down 744, decline there of just about 1.5%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down 477 for NASDAQ, a drop now of 2%. The NASDAQ 100 Index down 1.8%, and the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares down 0.9%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 Index particularly hard hit. That index down 2.6%. 10 years currently yielding 4.28% with a 2-year at 3.58%. Spot gold is surging to a record $47.58 where we stand right now, up 1.9%. Silver higher as well, up at $94.38, while West Texas Intermediate crude $60.50 a barrel. WTI up by about 1.8%. French President Emmanuel Macron is blasting President Trump's trade strategy, which he says is meant to subordinate the EU. The Danish pension fund, Academica Pension, will exit U.S. Treasuries. Also, the Canadian military has been modeling a hypothetical American invasion, that according to the Toronto Globe and Mail. Goldman Sachs Group and Qatar Investment Authority have agreed to expand their strategic partnership. Goldman Sachs shares today, right now they are down by 1.5%. Bank earnings, we did hear this morning from U.S. Bancorp, down 0.1%. Fifth Third up 1.9%. Key Corp down 1.5%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. They're modeling for a potential U.S. invasion. The headlines that you hear every day sometimes are too much to understand, but that's why you're on Bloomberg as we seek context and analysis, and that'll be our drive as we hear from President Trump coming up shortly here. I say shortly, we don't know. He was supposed to be in the briefing room at 1 o'clock, and 42 minutes have passed. We've got a briefing room, though, full of reporters when he does enter. It should be pretty high drama on what is 1 year to the day, first year of the second term in the bag. And the markets, as you just heard from Charlie, are not behaving very well. That's why we thought we'd spend a little extra time with Christine Aquino, who's working overtime today, managing editor at the Bloomberg Markets Live blog. Christine, welcome back. We spoke last hour, and it looks like we're digging ourselves into a slightly deeper hole here. Is this all geopolitics, or is there more at hand? It was a week ago yesterday that we were at all-time highs.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. I mean, I guess it is fair to say that this reaction started as a geopolitical risk premium that's being built back into U.S. assets, and therefore we're seeing declines, not just in the U.S. stock market, but also in treasuries and the dollar. So it really is an across-the-board sell-off. But I think what we're witnessing now is that momentum building upon itself, right? So the initial reaction was risk off. We saw that in Europe. We saw that in Asia. And then when the Americans got back from a long weekend, they saw what was happening. They pushed the sell button immediately. A little bit of lunchtime recovery, but we're back to the lows of the day. And this really just speaks to that powerful negative momentum that we start the week with, really just kind of permeating into the afternoon U.S. session here.
Across the board, right? I mean, we're looking at pretty tough decliners versus advancers. A couple of things are getting a bid so far. ExxonMobil actually hit an all-time high today, Christine, so there are some exceptions.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And this is kind of what makes this session and this sort of environment interesting, right? Is, again, we talked about how really gone are the days of one-way directional moves in equity markets and in markets in general, right? It's no longer a one-way bet based on a single catalyst. What we're seeing really is a little bit of differentiation. As you mentioned, some sectors doing particularly well because perhaps, you know, the geopolitical situation is more favorable to them. ExxonMobil makes a lot of sense given that the increase in oil prices that we've seen of late, and other companies also potentially kind of benefiting from that rotation out of the big tech stocks, which really is leading the way in the sell-off here. And investors kind of looking, hey, if I'm not buying tech stocks and I still have to own stocks, where else do I go? Maybe small caps.
Sure. Interesting. Christine, this is quite a moment we're in here. It's great to see you, and welcome back, as always, with us live from World Headquarters in New York. VIX is back above 20. I do want to mention, in the yield on the 10-year, 4.28, up about 1.4%. That's what's going up, which is not a great scenario here, obviously, as we watch stocks decline. We'll assemble our panel in just a moment here as we wait for the president to join us in the briefing room. This is a conversation that was set to begin some time ago, top of the hour, 1 o'clock, and you've, as you can see, got a room full of reporters. There's nowhere to put your coats in there, which I'm guessing is a pretty uncomfortable place to be right now. They put water on the podium, and we do expect the President of the United States to enter the room here to mark 1 year of his second term, and then, of course, prepare himself for the messaging that will follow tomorrow in Davos. The president will be wheels up tonight. He's got another event in the Oval Office, signing some legislation, and then heading out of town for a speech that will take place before the market open tomorrow. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are still with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, having spent some time with Ambassador Daniel Fried earlier, and the remarkable social media feed that the president assembled last evening here. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne is democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick, the president decides to lay down a marker here, and of course, he might not even know what he's about to say. This is not a scripted event. This is a news conference with a room full of hungry reporters. Is this what you would advise the president to do if you were in his corner here a year to the day after getting back in the White House?
Well, I think it's, as you described, maybe a hastily arranged event. Maybe they woke up this morning and realized this is the 1 year anniversary of his swearing in. And as you described earlier, there seems to be a handout going through, 365, accomplishments over 365 days. So if it is indeed a report card on his first year, I wouldn't do it from the White House briefing room. I'd go to a place somewhere around the country, somewhere that has been impacted, on affordability issues. And I'd make the case of how hard this administration is working for the people who really make America work. And for me, you only get this once. And as a prelude to about a month from now, a State of the Union speech, why wouldn't you want to use it to do what you've claimed is the most important issue in the White House this last month, is talking about affordability? But instead, I guess it's probably going to be a report card in the White House, which will go largely unnoticed to most people without a broader media outreach.